Okay, so here's what you need to understand. Picture the White House, March 13th, 2025. The President of the United States is standing in front of reporters and he says something that makes every economist in North America sit up a little straighter. We don't need their cars. We don't need their energy. We don't need their lumber. We don't need anything that they give. He's talking about Canada, America's largest trading partner, the country that shares a border spanning 5,525 miles. The nation that has been integrated into American supply chains for generations. And the president just declared, on camera, that America doesn't need any of it. Now, most people heard that statement and moved on. Another headline, another controversy, another day. But I want you to stay with me here, because what I'm about to walk you through is something that goes far beyond political theatre. This is about the architecture of how North America actually works. About dependencies so deep that most Americans have never thought about them. About consequences that would ripple through your daily life in ways you wouldn't see coming until they'd already arrived. Let me take you inside the numbers, the supply chains, the actual machinery of interdependence. Because when you understand what's really at stake, that statement stops sounding confident. It starts sounding dangerous. Let's begin with energy, because this is where the gap between rhetoric and reality becomes almost absurd. In 2024, the United States imported approximately 4.3 million barrels of crude oil from Canada every single day. Not per week, per day. That's 63% of all crude oil imports coming into America. Canada isn't just the largest supplier of American oil, it's not even close to having a competitor. But here's what makes this particularly interesting. The United States is the world's largest oil producer. American fields pump out more crude than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia. So why the dependency on Canadian oil? Because American refineries, particularly in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, were specifically designed to process heavy crude. The thick, sulfur-rich oil that Canada produces in abundance. American light sweet crude is excellent for certain applications, but you can't just swap it into these refineries without massive multi-billion-dollar retooling. Marathon Petroleum's Robinson refinery in Illinois runs on 100% Alberta crude. 100%. If Canadian supply stopped tomorrow, that facility would go dark. Not partially offline, dark. And it's not alone. According to the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission, the top 5 American refineries processing Canadian crude are locked into configurations that make switching suppliers somewhere between extraordinarily expensive and functionally impossible in any reasonable time frame. Now, let's talk about what happens to gas prices if this supply disappears. Energy economists estimate that losing Canadian crude would push gasoline prices up by 30 to 70 cents per gallon within weeks. Not months, weeks. That's not accounting for panic buying, speculation, or the inevitable market volatility that comes when 4 million barrels per day of supply suddenly vanishes. We're talking about immediate, measurable pain at every pump in America. And crude oil is just the beginning. Natural gas tells an even more revealing story. In 2024, the United States imported 8.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas from Canada every single day. Almost 100% of pipeline gas imports. The infrastructure to move this gas south has been built up over decades. Pipelines, compression stations, distribution networks, all engineered around the assumption that Canadian gas flows south and American gas flows to export terminals. But here's where it gets locally critical. New York, New England, the upper Midwest. These regions depend on Canadian natural gas for heating, electricity generation, industrial processes. When temperatures drop and demand spikes, Canadian supply isn't a convenience. It's the difference between keeping the lights on and rolling blackouts. Penn State energy professor Seth Bloomsack put it bluntly. If Canadian hydro imports get cut off, you're not replacing that with wind and solar. You're replacing it with power plants burning natural gas or fuel oil. Higher emissions, higher pollution, higher costs. States like New York and Massachusetts have been trying to reduce carbon emissions, partly by buying Canadian hydroelectric power. Clean, renewable, reliable. A disruption doesn't just threaten energy security, it threatens climate goals that have been decades in the making. Now, let me shift gears because energy is only part of this equation. Let's talk about something most Americans have never heard of, but absolutely cannot live without: critical minerals. The United States government identifies 50 minerals as critical to economic and national security. Guess how many of those America is 100% import reliant on? 12. And for another 29, the US depends on imports for more than 50% of supply. Canada produces over 60 minerals and metals, including 21 of the 50 on America's critical list. Canada also produces or refines 10 out of the 12 NATO defence critical raw materials. Let me give you some specific examples so this doesn't stay abstract. Potash. Canada supplies the vast majority of potash used in American agriculture. Without it, fertiliser production craters. Crop yields fall, food prices rise. Uranium. Canada is one of the world's largest producers, and American nuclear power plants depend on that supply. No uranium, no nuclear energy. And nuclear provides nearly 20% of American electricity. Zinc, nickel, tellurium, vanadium. Between 50 and 80% of US requirements for these essential minerals come from Canadian mines. These aren't luxury items, they're inputs for steel production, battery manufacturing, defence systems, electronics. The kind of materials where supply disruptions don't just inconvenience industries, they shut them down. And here's the part that should genuinely worry defence planners. Rare earth elements. The 17 metals essential for everything from F-35 actuators to guided missile systems to advanced electronics. China dominates global supply, refining over 90% of the world's rare earths. The US has been desperately trying to diversify away from Chinese dependency. Canada was supposed to be the answer. Canadian mining expertise combined with American processing technology, creating a North American supply chain independent of Beijing. That strategy doesn't work if you're simultaneously threatening to economically isolate your most reliable mineral partner. In April 2025, China restricted exports of 5 critical minerals to the United States. The result? Ford had to temporarily halt production at its Chicago plant because of a shortage of rare earth magnets needed for electric power steering. Tesla faced similar disruptions. US automakers warned that vehicle assembly could grind to a halt within weeks if rare earth shipments didn't resume. One brief restriction from one country nearly paralysed American automotive manufacturing. Now imagine what happens if Canada, which supplies massive quantities of the minerals needed to reduce Chinese dependency, suddenly becomes unreliable because of trade wars and annexation threats. Speaking of automotive, let's talk about cars. Because the integration between American and Canadian auto manufacturing isn't just close, it's molecular. A single vehicle assembled in Detroit might cross the US-Canada border 6 or 7 times during production. Components manufactured in Ontario get shipped to Michigan for subassembly. Those subassemblies go back to Canada for integration. The finished modules return to the US for final assembly. This isn't inefficiency, it's optimization. Decades of investment in synchronized supply chains that treat the border as an accounting line, not a barrier. Canadian-made auto parts flow into American factories at a rate of billions of dollars per month. Engines, transmissions, electrical systems, safety components. The supply chain is so intertwined that the phrase often used is, "You can't unscramble an egg." Ontario alone supports 675,000 direct export-related jobs tied to American markets. Many of those jobs involve making parts that American vehicles literally cannot be built without. Tariffs, trade barriers, or supply disruptions don't just raise prices. They force manufacturers to completely redesign production networks built up over generations. We're talking about years of reconfiguration, tens of billions in capital costs, and massive job losses on both sides of the border during the transition. And all of this sits within the framework of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which replaced NAFTA in 2020. That agreement was negotiated, signed, and implemented specifically to lock in North American economic integration, to create certainty, to allow businesses to invest with confidence that the rules wouldn't change on a whim. But when the president threatens to make Canada the 51st state, when he says America doesn't need Canadian goods, when he imposes tariffs that violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the agreement he signed, that certainty evaporates. And markets hate uncertainty more than almost anything. Let me give you the trade numbers because they matter more than the rhetoric. In 2024, the United States imported $422 billion worth of goods from Canada. America exported $348 billion to Canada. That's a trade deficit of around $74 billion in goods. But when you include services, which the US dominates, the deficit shrinks to somewhere between $36 and $45 billion. Now, the president has claimed the deficit is $200 billion. That number doesn't appear in any official statistics, not from the US Census Bureau, not from Statistics Canada, not from any recognised trade authority. It's inflated by a factor of 4 or 5. But more importantly, even if the number were accurate, a trade deficit is not a subsidy. Americans aren't giving Canada money out of goodwill. They're receiving value. Energy, minerals, auto parts, lumber, manufactured goods. Real products that American consumers and businesses need. The trade relationship exists because it benefits both countries. Canada gets access to the world's largest consumer market. America gets reliable supplies of essential materials at competitive prices from a stable, friendly neighbour. Disrupting that doesn't make America more independent. It makes America more expensive, less efficient, and strategically weaker. And here's something most coverage misses. Canada isn't just dependent on the US. The dependency runs both ways, but it's asymmetric in ways that matter. Take electricity. 86 international power lines connect American states and Canadian provinces. The electricity systems are fully interconnected. Canada exports clean hydroelectric power to the northeast. America exports power to parts of Canada when demand spikes. It's a balanced exchange that improves reliability on both sides. But when Canadian provinces threaten to cut electricity exports in response to Trump's tariffs, states like New York and Michigan suddenly realised how much their grids depend on that northern supply. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford proposed, then retracted, a 25% surcharge on electricity exports. The threat alone was enough to send American officials scrambling. Or consider this. Parts of Canada, particularly Ontario and Quebec, depend heavily on oil and natural gas that transit through the United States. About half the natural gas consumed in these provinces comes from American sources. Quebec's Montreal refinery depends entirely on crude delivered via the US, with no immediate alternatives. So Canada has vulnerabilities too. Energy insecurity that American policy could exploit. But here's the critical distinction. When you're in a relationship of mutual dependency, weaponizing that dependency doesn't just hurt the other side, it damages both. And it destroys the trust that makes cooperation possible in the future. Right now, as of January 2026, that trust is eroding fast. Trump has repeatedly floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state. He's referred to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, now Mark Carney, as governor. He's posted AI-generated images showing Canada, Greenland and Venezuela as American territory. He's threatened military action, then clarified he means economic force, which somehow doesn't make it less alarming. Canadian polls show that 90% of Canadians oppose annexation. 90%. In an April 2025 poll, 82% said they'd rather become a dominion of the British Empire again than be annexed by the United States. Think about that. Canadians are so opposed to the idea that they'd prefer to go backwards in time to colonial status rather than join America. And it's not just public opinion. Canadian politicians across the spectrum, from Liberals to Conservatives to NDP, have united in opposition. Canada will never be the 51st state, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre declared. There isn't a snowball's chance in hell, said former Prime Minister Trudeau. Never, 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 Prime Minister Carney told Trump directly. But the damage isn't just diplomatic, it's economic. Uncertainty is poison for investment. When businesses don't know if tariffs will be imposed, if borders will be respected, if agreements will be honoured, they stop investing. They hoard cash, they delay projects, they look for alternatives. And Canada is looking for alternatives. In the first 10 months of 2025, Canadian exports to the United States fell 4.1% compared to the same period in 2024. Meanwhile, exports to countries other than the US have been growing. Canada is actively diversifying away from American dependency, not because it's economically optimal, but because relying on an unpredictable partner is a strategic risk. So let's play this out. What actually happens if America tries to go without Canada? Gas prices spike immediately, 30 to 70 cents per gallon within weeks, potentially more if markets panic. Home heating costs rise as natural gas supply tightens. Electricity prices jump in the northeast and upper Midwest. Rolling blackouts become a real possibility during peak demand. Automobile production slows, then stops in many facilities as part shortages cascade through supply chains. Vehicle prices rise as manufacturers scramble to find alternative suppliers. Delivery times stretch from weeks to months. Defence contractors struggle to source critical minerals for weapons systems. F-35 production faces delays. Submarine construction stalls. Missile manufacturing hits bottlenecks. The Pentagon's efforts to reduce Chinese dependency on rare earths collapse because the Canadian alternative has been destroyed. Food prices rise as fertiliser costs jump due to potash shortages. Agricultural yields drop. Farmers pay more for inputs and pass those costs to consumers. Electronics manufacturing faces disruptions. Computer production, smartphone assembly, data centre construction all depend on minerals that Canada supplies. Shortages ripple through tech supply chains. And all of this happens while America is simultaneously fighting trade wars with China, threatening Europe, and trying to maintain global economic leadership. Allies watch as the US treats its closest partner with open hostility and wonder if they're next. Trust erodes, coalitions fracture, American influence wanes. Now, I want to be clear. None of this means Canada is perfect or that the relationship doesn't have genuine issues that need addressing. Trade disputes over dairy, lumber, and other sectors are real. Border security is a legitimate concern. Balanced economic relationships require ongoing negotiation and adjustment. But there's a difference between tough negotiation and fundamental destabilisation, between pushing for better terms and threatening the entire framework, between using leverage and destroying the relationship. What we're watching right now is a stress test, not just of US-Canada relations, but of whether American power can be wielded productively or whether it collapses into chaos. Whether allies can trust American commitments or whether every agreement is subject to being torn up on presidential whim. The answer matters far beyond trade statistics. It determines whether America can build the coalitions necessary to compete with China, whether democracies can cooperate effectively, whether the post-World War II order of rules-based trade survives or gives way to pure power politics. And here's what frustrates people who actually understand these systems. The irony. The complete, almost comical irony of declaring, "We don't need Canada," while being deeply, structurally dependent on Canadian resources to maintain American living standards. You don't need Canadian energy? 4 million barrels per day say otherwise. You don't need Canadian minerals? The Pentagon's critical minerals strategy is built around Canadian supply. You don't need Canadian auto parts. Detroit would like a word. You don't need Canadian lumber. American housing construction depends on it. The rhetoric of independence collides with the reality of interdependence, and reality doesn't care about talking points. So here's where we are. A president who claims America doesn't need Canada, a neighbour that's 90% opposed to becoming American, supply chains integrated over generations, dependencies running in both directions, trust eroding daily, and consequences that most people won't understand until they're paying more at the pump, at the grocery store, for their next car, for everything that depends on the silent machinery of North American trade. This isn't sustainable. Something has to give. Either the rhetoric moderates and relationships stabilise, or the integration starts unwinding and both countries pay the price. There's no version of this where America successfully goes it alone without significant economic pain. The dependencies are too deep, the alternatives too expensive, the timeline too long. Canada isn't some distant trading partner that America could replace with minimal disruption. It's the neighbour whose economy is fused with America's at every level. Energy, minerals, manufacturing, agriculture, services. 76% of Canadian exports go to the United States. But America depends on those exports more than most people realise. You want to know what happens when America says, we don't need Canada? Watch gas prices. Watch electricity costs. Watch vehicle availability. Watch defence production. Watch food prices. Watch tech supply chains. Watch every sector where Canadian inputs have been taken for granted for so long that people forgot they existed. And then watch as Canada, faced with an unreliable partner, diversifies away from American dependency. Watch as the integration that made both countries stronger slowly unwinds. Watch as competitors fill gaps that America created through its own choices. This is what happens, not in theory, not in abstract economics, but in the real world where supply and demand and infrastructure and investment decisions determine whether lights stay on and cars get built and weapons systems function. The president says America doesn't need Canada. The data, the supply chains, the actual physical reality of how North America works all say something very different. And when rhetoric collides with reality, reality wins. Every time. Eventually. The question is how much damage gets done before that lesson sinks in. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really at stake in US-Canada relations, not just the headlines but the actual dependencies and consequences, consider hitting that subscribe button. And drop a comment. Do you think this relationship can be repaired? Or are we watching the beginning of a fundamental shift in how North America works? I'm genuinely curious what you think.